Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Politics of Gender, the only show on YouTube where someone mansplains and womansplains what it means to be a man and a woman through the lens of Ivan Illich, our boy, this particular book club. How you doing, Maria?
Very tired.
Sleepy.
Yes.
This is a tough part
Sorry,
about.
guys. But I'm really excited to talk about the end of the book. I really enjoyed the last chapter. There's a lot of gold nuggets at the very end.
Totally. Yeah, and just to recollect a little bit, we are in the middle of a book club that's trying to get a particular thinker's work on gender. We've been doing this periodically. We do this Butler. We're going to do it with other people like Zizek, I hope. But right now, stalling here on Illich to talk about really an underdeveloped, or not underdeveloped, but like a thinker that hasn't really been appreciated as much for his influence within the current discussion of gender. I think readers by now can see why he doesn't really fit with a lot of the basic narratives on gender and gender equality.
Yeah, he doesn't fit nicely into the right or the left.
No, that's for
he
sure.
just gets left out.
Yeah, he's not. You can't really use him well as a weapon.
No.
And speaking of which, we're actually going to start not by praising him, but by a little bit of a critique, because we left this part because, in my mind, Illich ends up with a kind of disappointing conclusion on the origins of what he calls economic sex. Just to clarify once more, if you're just dropping in, Illich has this concept that all of human societies prior to the modern period were governed by something he calls gender, which is asymmetrical governance of the world by men and women. So it's a real difference and distinction in which men and women are not simply seen as versions of the same type, as modes of the human being, as sort of a sexed version of a fundamentally androgynous human nature, but in fact, as two distinct members of the human family that have their own authority and domain to occupy, so that there's a certain lack of envious comparison, competition, and fighting, really, between men and women. Not that this gendered world is without abuse, without evil hierarchy, without problems by any means.
But it was just people understood men and women as operating within two different worlds. And so you couldn't compare them as being genderless and exactly the same.
Yeah. Whereas in modernity, we seem to have reduced that entirely to the bathroom.
Yeah.
And so the last of our fights is over the bathroom.
That's
as
really
we mentioned before.
embarrassing.
I know, we're just toilet people. Who would have thunk? So he has this, I think, a very brilliant and compelling case. You might disagree with him on the details, but the truth of the matter is that there has been a fundamental shift in the way we view sexual difference. One of the things I always like to ask when I look at transgenderism and ideas of gender fluidity and such is, okay, you can critique it for this or that reason, but why is it so apparently consumable? Why does it just sort of fit with our world? And I think what Illich provides is a way of saying, no, this fits with our world because because we're actually built to appear to ourselves as androgynous, as economic neuters, as he calls it. And I think that's really important for two reasons, which I'll give. One, I think that a lot of the times, Americans especially, and Western liberals generally, are very motivated by the spirit of rebellion wherever they can find it. And gender theory, gender critical theory, especially, has this kind of vision of itself as being on the side of the oppressed, over and against a tyrannical force that's prescribing a certain way of being a body. It's saying, no, all of this has nothing to do with nature. This is just a construction of power saying that you have to live in this certain way. And so that puts the person who can be differently identified, who can be queer, who can sort of break with these norms, within the exalted position of the rebel within our society, which is just what we want. It's what we've wanted since the...
Not to say that it's an easy position, but it's the lauded position.
It is.
It's
what our movies are about.
Sense, yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think they're always wrong. I think, in fact, one of the things we're hoping to point out through Illich is that there really is a tyrannical construction going on. It's just not necessarily the one that we think of immediately. Because what we tend to do, I think, in modernity is have this seamless line from like, well, what all the Christians and medievals and church people and ancients thought up until now, when we are throwing off all of that oppression. That
Yeah,
seems
like
to
it's
be the
all the
basic narrative.
same. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, no. Just like that, it's like a twofold movement. It's like, well, what modern people do is we reject all of that old stuff, and that old stuff is always the same. So even if
Right.
it's like the Victorian kind of fussiness about gender, or it's the
Mm-hmm.
medieval sort of, clear and distinct roles and worlds, or the Christian understanding, whatever it is, like it's all just the same. It's all the old stuff.
Yeah.
So we shirk it off. We get rid of it. Um, and what Illich is pointing out is that no, there's a transition prior to this moment
Mm-hmm.
that it gets totally missed. There is a certain world, right? And it's not the case that the gendered world is what's being rebelled against right now. Because
Right.
prior
Right.
to our current rebellion, you have a transition in which that gendered world is destroyed, and what's put in its place is a certain androgynous ideal of the human person who now wears sex like a pair of shorts. Or gloves. I think I'm supposed to say gloves. Who wears his sex as a certain modification of a fundamental sameness, a kind of
Right.
neuter anthropology, you might say. And it's important because the rebellion against that is something I think a Catholic even can validate.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like, insofar as what we're describing as like normal male female or male female norm, if it really is what Illich is saying, then we should be sort of repulsed by it in some ways, right? So if you're saying
Right.
like, oh, I don't want to be this, it's very obvious that you're just saying that this fundamentally economic being is modified through, hormones, or through having a different role in society to be what's viewed as this substantively different person, but that's not really true. That seems to be something that I would at least get on board with and be like, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, we tend to. I mean, it makes sense. We tend to assume that what's normal for us, what we assume, I mean, as kind of like our myth
mm-hmm.
of what the human person is also what people used to think. And so we look at injustices today, and then we look at injustices happening in the 1200s, and the thought process is, well, obvious, the same thing was happening, the same thought was happening, it was just worse.
Right,
It was
totally.
just a larger scale. But then what Illich is pointing out is that the way people conceived of men and women is just so fundamentally
Yeah.
different. There is this kind of, I think he calls it broken gender. Is
Yeah.
that it? Like a period of the movement from the gendered domains into economic sex. And so it's kind of weird because there's overlap. You have
Mm-hmm.
both going on at the same time. Um, but yeah, what people are rebelling against today is not actually the thing that was happening in the
Right,
1200s.
totally.
And I've just experienced that pattern with multiple things, looking back on the past, like just basic concepts of words that we assume were the same over the time but really aren't. I mean, I think that's why the Catholic social teaching encyclicals are so difficult to read, because we just assume that all the words mean what they mean today.
Yeah, right.
And we're doing the same thing with gender.
Yeah, it seems like Illich would look at our gender equality fights and say, okay, what we are fighting about today is how does a substantively similar being, how is that being equally represented? How is that being get the same amount of compensation for their labor? It's a matter of equality between two functionally similar things.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the past, he's arguing that there's no comparison. What's being discussed here is two distinct domains of which men and women were the authorities respectively, and which they
Mm-hmm.
weren't competing for some common, I was going to say common good, but that's not quite right, is it? In which they weren't competing for some sexless ideal, genderless ideal that was between them. And that does seem to be right. I mean, if you read just medieval literature, the idea of a envy for each other's world, or rather an view of like I want everything that a man has, and a man should want everything that a woman has unto a certain equality. It just doesn't seem present.
He's got a fantastic example of this in the last chapter, but I think we want to wait to get there.
Okay, because we were going to critique the guy because he has all this brilliance and he has this great way of shaking up the narrative so that you no longer have to be like, well, I'm either one of them stodgy male-female guys or I'm one of those cool gender-fluid guys. It's like, well, you can actually be a cool male-female guy or a stodgy gender-fluid guy, because his argument is that like industrial capitalism is the gender-fluid guys. So it's, anyways, but the point is, despite all of this excitement, when he looks around for a real...
like, what made this move?
Yeah.
How do we start moving into broken gender, into economic sex? His answer is the church.
The church, yeah. I mean, he has a sort of causal argument that really he's lifting from Foucault in his History of Sexuality, and that's fine. It's just I'm disappointed a little bit because, you know, Ivan doesn't usually just lift things, and this really does feel like a repetition. But I think it would be best to kind of to give his argument first by discussing broken gender, so we're clear on that definition, and then by going into his blaming of the church for the move into economic sex, which is, he says, irredeemably sexist. So broken gender is the idea that the church at some point, and the society at large, reduced the space for genuinely gendered domains and authority. The argument is not that they were obliterated the way they are within modern capitalism. The argument is that you basically had households that were the same separation between the sexes, a female domain, a male domain, real authority, real difference, the dance of the two that we've discussed, but that the church was beginning to rule those households as also sexless or genderless units. So, for instance, one of the examples he uses is that where there used to be gendered rents that were expected from each household, where the male would give what was proper to male work to the lord as his rent, the female would give what was proper to female work as her rent. Now this was translated into a genderless means of exchange, aka money, and the household itself gave its genderless offering. And so not only the society, but the church as a whole seemed to then take a view of the soul as being genderless in some way.
So one thing I wasn't quite sure if he was saying, so I remember he's talking about one critique where you start, as soon as you start using money more, especially in terms of taxes, this changes how you perceive the household, how you perceive the members of the household. This is happening at the same time that the church is confessional. But it's not, it's just kind of, it's the same cultural moment, but it's not that the church's mistake, according to his understanding, comes first. This is just simultaneously happening, was my impression.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think the taxing thing comes much earlier, if I recall. But it's also important to realize that Illich is not making the mistake that moderns make, which is to look for the church in the medieval age, as opposed to say who's taxing who or who's paying rents to who. It's like the presumption of the Middle Ages is that everything was the church, everyone was the church, and they were all governed by churchy type things, like
churchy things.
So that being the case, I think it's a more general, and maybe that's one of his. Maybe that's one of the reasons I don't like it, is because he'll switch from that, which seems like the right attitude, to suddenly blaming the priests as if like they're the church and everything else is just like the otherwise organically, locally developing society. Church. But before we get into that, I just want us to understand his vision. He's saying there's about 500 years in which 500 years of broken gender, where he's saying that there was this sort of theoretical centralized model in which the church and larger institutions of society are essentially judging the genderless family unit as the proper political unit, as the object of their care, as he'll say.
He's got sorry, I just have to interrupt. There's a great footnote on page 167 It's titled The Civilization of Broken Gender.
Okay.
He says, well into the Middle Ages, the marriage tie still did not aim directly at the creation of a couple. And so what he's meaning by that, that's part of the move into the economic sex. So you have marriage being understood as like you have two sides of the gender domain being like tied together and this not. And then when you get to the economic sex, it's just these two individuals that are kind of making a contract together. And then he continues on and says the wedding knitted what were often elaborate ties between the members of two kinship groups, their holdings, their status, and their offspring. This kind of marriage took a bewildering variety of forms. It fostered subsistence and strengthened the peasant's ability to resist the demands of king and lord. I really like that last line, and I think I think when you are paying taxes in a gendered form, what that inevitably means that the way that the king or lord is forced to deal with you is in a much more particular way. There's no avoiding it. And when you're dealt with particularly, there's a lot less control that you can have over that person. If someone's just a number, like you can organize numbers easily and move them around, make them do what you want. But if someone is like a particular household or has particular goods, they're just not as controllable. And so that kind of culture just made households that the kings and the lords just couldn't control. It's not possible for them to control in the same way.
Right. And his next sentence, I think, shows the alternative vision that he sees as typical of marriages in the regime of broken gender. A new type of marriage that appeared during the 11th century aimed directly at the creation of a tie between the two gendered co-producers of rent. Whew. Brutal. I mean, I don't think it's a bit one-sided, you know. It's like because the other thing that's happening here is the church is simultaneously constructing, as it were, the idea of marriage for love out of. So what I mean is, there's a way to describe this that sure sounds like that.
Yeah.
But there's a whole nother way of describing that's like, well, part of the difficulty of marriage being a means of exchange between kinship groups is that what is lost in some ways is the person, and love for the person. And you could describe really the history of modernity as the gradual, and not modernity, just history, as the gradual unveiling of the uniqueness and importance of the person. Right now we're in an age where we're actually, it sometimes sounds like we're critical of this, because what has been totally neglected is that precisely because he's a social creature, is he also so valuable uniquely as a person. And this is a dynamism between society and individual that can't be scraped. But I think that in some way, Illich is just ignoring that whole narrative here.
Yeah, so if we keep going with the footnote, he says the church elevates the mutual agreement consensus into a sacrament, and the couple becomes a sacred institution. So like what he's describing is the development of like the doctrine, the teaching, the sacrament of marriage, and how that's understood within the church. And you can take his kind of cynical view, or you could think of what the church is doing is almost highlighting or bringing forward an element that was always there from the beginning.
No, and that's one of the things. I mean, it's hard
to forefront to our attention.
Yeah, and it's hard to take this totally seriously when you have like the scriptural and early patristic understandings of marriage as being a lot. I mean, if you think about the entire metaphor of the bride and the church, or rather Christ and the church being the bridegroom and the bride, and the kind of how much more that was present in such an earlier time, which can only really have its full meaning, and it can only really have been used by people like St. Paul in the way that it's used if there was an emphasis on the uniqueness, on love, on sacrifice, on unity of a whole. Like if you're going to describe Christ and his marriage to the church as I'm going to use his words here, as the creation of a tie between the two gendered co-producers of rent, rather than something like personal ecstasy between two people, I think you would have a hard time understanding most of the patristic tradition. So it just seems like he's sort of picking and
says
choosing
that this
a bit.
is something that happens later on, and it's like almost a mistake of the church when you find that theology there right at the beginning in the patristic.
It just has
tradition.
earlier precedents. It's it's maybe a mistake based on how they're doing it, based on what was 50 years prior, but 500 years prior, maybe, you know what I mean? It's like this is what's troublesome and difficult about historical arguments, is that they're so, like, they all can kind of make sense. Like, well, that causes this and this causes that. And you can kind of walk down the line, and then it's not that it's wrong. It's just that you can do another genealogy that says, well, no, this caused that and that caused that. And it's like, well, that sounds like it's likely too. And it's, it's
or
very
you just
difficult
zoom out more, and then the thing that you notice is still true, but now it means something different now that it's in a bigger picture.
Yeah. Well, and we'll try to get to that, I think. So Illich's argument is, I think, best put on 153, and I'm just going to read it to make it clear. And his argument is this is the sort of ecclesiastical change that created the genderless person as the true unit of society, and began the destruction of gendered worlds. And he says that it was through the invention of a pastor who had standardized care over souls. And this is where he's getting a lot of Foucaultian stuff. So I will read it. The medieval shift from Orthodox faith to Catholic behavior. And whenever he says Catholic behavior, he's being pejorative. He means like universalizing behavior, usually. The conversion of priests from men deputed? I don't know how to say that.
I think that's right.
Deputed to liturgical service, turning them into pastors and confessors of a flock, standardized the two sexes. For the pastor, now represented by the image of the celibate cock on the steeple, was watching over a flock that included two sexes. He goes on. He's in charge. Well, he calls him the prototype of the service professional, which is his biggest diss. The pastor is in charge of souls and equipped with the language to read their consciences. All the souls under his responsibility, he is taught, are of equal dignity and possess consciences to be examined and formed. This was a new and rising church. And he says, this new law, he's talking about the Lateran Council, which imposed on he says, Lateran Council imposed on all the faithful of the church the duty of telling their sins once a year to their own parish priest. This new law had been introduced with an original formula, reflecting a novel perspective, the homogenizing perspective of sex. Omnis utriusque sexus fidelis, all the faithful, men as well as women, are henceforth held to speak every year to their appointed pastor and reveal their sins. To enable the pastor to listen to these confessions, a new literature had come into being during the preceding century. Manuals advised the confessor on the sorts of questions to ask the faithful. Increasingly, the new manuals defined this transgression meant for humans in general, independent and sometimes contradictory to the local gender line. By restricting power, privilege, and ordination to men, church law was not sexist, it simply reflected its sources. Church law did pioneer sexism by ruling on the consciences of equally immortal souls, capable of committing the same sin with different bodies. By equating in terms of sin the transgressions of the same law by both men and women, it laid the foundation for sexist codes. Okay. That's basically the argument. I mean, he gives it a few more times in different ways. Men and women become equals in sin, for instance, on the next page. So what I want to do is this. I want to try to describe the argument, if that's fair. And then I want to describe what I think is like the best version of it, which is not necessarily what Illich means at this point in time.
Right. Okay.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. So the argument is essentially that within gender domains, there is real distinction. Okay. There are things, stuff, tools, words, times, places that are for men and vice versa for women. These are asymmetric worlds that can't simply be ordered as like a comparative thing, nor can one be swapped out for the other.
Right. So then if men and women transgress, they're always going to transgress as men and women within those domains.
Right.
But then as soon as you have a church and a little manual telling you this is the penance that goes to this sin, then you're treating all transgressions as if they're being done by genderless persons. It doesn't matter who comes into the confessional. You commit this sin, well, like, say, these prayers.
Yeah, and Illich is contrasting this with what previously he's called probity. Now, probity is like conscience, it's like morality, it has a certain similarity to that idea, but what makes probity distinct is that it is the sense of breaking with what is proper to your men, or what is breaking what is proper to your women. So again, we have to go back to the bathroom example because it's the only one we have, and we have to just cling to the toilet as best as we're able. Because what he's saying is you were filled with what we might call a shame because we don't know anything else, but he would say it's not even shame. Shame is related to something different. But you're filled with a sense of violating what is proper to the authority and domain of your gendered world, right? That this is transgression within the gendered world. This is probity. So there.
Yeah, so he's not really talking about sin. It's just like the embarrassment of, oh, this is not the right space.
Yes.
I do not belong here. I need to get out now.
Yeah, and you're governed by others because, I mean, and we still have this, right? Like, we all govern each other, especially at a younger age, before we realize that, we're all just individuals and need to treat each other exactly the same. We all naturally end up governing each other on the playground or whatever. Like, well, that's not what guys do, or that's not what girls do. And of course, this leads to all sorts of problems. But it's obviously welling up from within kids. They don't have to really be taught much to do this. But he's saying that you had a whole system of coercion, of the governance of behavior, of guilt and forgiveness, and all this happening simply in relation to the gendered domains. And he's arguing that what the church is doing is getting rid of that by saying, no, sin is sin. It doesn't matter who commits it. And it is experienced in relation to a universal law that applies equally to men and women, for which there are universal solutions, penances. And yeah, fair. So that's my summary of it.
I'm still not entirely clear if what he is upset is that so in each society they're going to have their own constructions on what is proper to men and women, and is he just saying when the church comes in she disregards these things?
Yeah, totally.
And she just universalizes transgressions. And it's almost like she like wipes them out and stamps them out. And the only transgression that becomes like the real transgression is the sin, which is sexless and belongs to everyone.
Yep. The consecrated male, the priestly judge, listens each year to a genderless soul, measuring its transgressions of a written law. So he has this vision of the church as destroying what was before, and then the vision of a kind of self-immolating or self-sacrificial thing that the one who confesses does. That he enters into the confessional, goes into this mode of relation to the priest, in which he has to leave his gender at the door, as it were. Mm-hmm. And so that this is actually a sort of training in genderlessness, in the breaking down of those worlds. Yeah, and again, this is what Foucault says, really.
Right, which I mean, if you're right, it would make sense because those kinds of cultural practices. I mean, when we engage culturally in practices of leaving gender at the door, like really pretending like it's absolutely irrelevant, then it starts to actually become that way, and that's how social change moves. So it's not. Yes, I see what he's going for.
Yes. Okay. So here's where I want to say he's right, and I don't know about the time and the place exactly, like in which times and in which places. I mean, he's being very broad about this. Mm-hmm. But I want to speak both from like a personal perspective and then what I know of the history here. The church in recent times, especially since the Second Vatican Council, has opposed almost universally what we call the manual tradition.
Which he references, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So if you read someone like Aquinas, you have maybe like the opposite. It's where you have this very rich vision of human sin and human redemption, where it is couched within this whole narrative in which we are either participating in the city of man or the city of God, in which we have, by sinning, we are rejecting God and his rule over us and our whole societies. It's part of the history of salvation. It's why God died for us. I mean, I'm just picking and choosing here, but it's a rich totality of the story.
Yeah, sin isn't just transgression against the law.
Yes.
It's something that's fit inside an entire narrative and context. It's fit inside of like a social ascent or a social descent, and so you can't just limit it to transgression.
Right. And in fact, the whole story of Christianity is a certain freedom from that, a freedom from the law, where we are not simply under a legal code. We are actually invited into a personal relationship with Christ, and it is through that that personal relationship and his salvific act that we are redeemed, such that the confessional becomes, in truth, a participation in his salvific act. So if you think about the Bible, you have Jesus giving the power to forgive sins to his disciples, and you have the command that we confess our sins to one another. So right from the very beginning, there is a sense that it's not simply there's a code, there's the violation of it, there's the coercion of sinners back into line. Rather, all of that is subordinated to the personal relationship with Christ. So an offense, a sin, becomes much more a offense against someone. It's an injustice against someone. It's a relational problem, right? Like you're excommunicated every time you sin. In a literal sense, you're excommunicated. You're out of communion, both with your neighbor and with God. And so the point about confession is to enter deeper into communion, into the city of God, to build up your society together as you become more and more conformed to the heavenly kingdom that Christ wants to build. Okay.
Right. So I guess like an analogy we could think about is the family. So you could have a very like truncated vision of what's going on when like a child misbehaves, like, oh, like he like broke the family rule and now he's antagonistic against the father. But what is really going on is that you have like this very rich like dynamic family rhythm that's like oriented towards the whole family flourishing and enjoying life together. And what's actually happening is a disruption in that fruitful, life-giving pattern. It's not just merely, oh, he made his dad angry.
Totally. And the problem with the manual tradition, we're going to describe as such, is that it takes the perspective of the sinner and then kind of makes it the perspective of the confessor. And what I mean is that when you are out of that rhythm, when you are willfully turning your back on the relationship, then it does appear that all of these things you should do and should not do are simply this extrinsic legal code, because that's precisely what it means, is that you have extrinsified, you have removed yourself from the relationship, and when you remove yourself from a relationship, all it looks like is code. All it looks like is law, and ultimately arbitrary law.
I mean, that's the perspective of every like grade schooler ever. Like, this is so ridiculous. I don't understand these rules, and then all of a sudden, like, you become the teacher, and everything makes sense to you. Like, oh, I see that all these things are necessary, not for those isolated, like cases, but for the whole thing to function together.
Yeah, or like as a father, you know, I remember the rebellions of my youth as being against a certain like perceptively unreasonable code or something. But then I only realize now, becoming a father, how lightly I hold any rules I have. It's like I don't care about the rules. I'm simply using them functionally in order to help the child live in peace and grow up and become virtuous. Like, so as a child, you take the rules more seriously than the adult takes the rules. You're confused because you're not wise yet. You're still sinful. Anyways, the manual tradition does seem to at least have lent itself to a perversion within our moral understanding that emphasized the sinner's relation to sin rather than the confessor's relation to sin. So it kind of comes from the angle, as it were, of man in his sin and not God in his redemptive act, such that it can become like a purity ritual almost, where you're Confessing is simply that you have a certain number of marks on your soul and you need them to be cleared. It has a kind of monetary exchange factor. So you go in and you do the thing, you confess your sins, you feel the relief of forgiveness, and you exchange for that forgiveness a certain penance, as it were. And that this isn't associated with any dynamic movement outside of kind of more rote formulas of agreeing to do better. That rather the sinner is sort of forgiven, and this is presumed to put him back into the same place. Like he's back to square one. He's going to get dirty again, and then we'll have to go back to be cleaned. He's going to get hurt again, and he'll have to be healed. You know what I mean? Like there's a certain there's not the sense of ascent. There's just the sense of repetition. And then there's the sense that the code is what is most vital. So the manual itself, while I do not think intending to do this, like I think it was just supposed to help people, like know the law of the church and know like the basics of right and wrong. But when it was taken literally as like, these are the sins, they're in this book. These are the penances, they're in this book. And human beings are very prone to literalizing things. You can see how this could tend to a sort of perversion, which again, the church, especially in figures like, our latest popes has rejected and moved on. The point is that it can really be a perversion, and that needs to be acknowledged. But it would be too much to simply say, well, Illich is right about this perverse time, but we got better, we got over that, because it's not just the case that like the church is making mistakes. The people are the church.
Yes.
The priests are from the families that are then being governed by this mode of confession. So what I mean to say is, especially now, we have the tendency to think of the church as like this centralized agency, like a big nonprofit with a pope at the top, and he sort of disseminates things down. And to the degree that's false now, it's so much more false with the Middle Ages, where you just didn't have the capacity even for that kind of centralized stuff. I mean, when we're talking about the church doing something, we are talking about an eminently local practice. We're talking about parish life. Yeah, with centralized moves, like you're getting directives from your bishop, of course. But the actual enacting of it is happening on the ground level.
Yeah,
which means to some extent, this tradition must have fit and made sense and been a part of the very worlds that are enacting it themselves. It's the very priests and religious who are coming from the very families who are living in these gendered domains who are then in some way enacting what Illich is critiquing. And maybe all I'm really saying is like, you can rag on the manual tradition, but you can certainly also see like a child or someone within addiction or someone in just a moral place at which the manual tradition is the best that they can attain to. And it's the belief of the church that the grace goes way beyond our intentions, right? So maybe this person comes into the confessional looking for a purity ritual. Maybe the priest has a manual and he's not considering anything beyond breaks in the legal code that he must rectify with his pastoral power. Maybe. I mean, that sounds unlikely, but maybe that's what's happening. But the point is that what the church is it administers a grace, the love of God, that is actually what's efficacious in the forgiveness of sins. And it goes way beyond their intentions. It has a healing process that actually brings you up out of addiction, out of, panic sort of ritual purity traps that you might be in. And I just don't think, and you've said this before, but I don't think Illich believes in grace.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my main critiques of what he was saying about confession, because as soon as you believe that what's happening in the confessional is actually supernatural, I mean, you're going to have like two flawed people entering into this act of confession, but the thing that's actually working is God's grace. And if you have that perspective, that automatically changes the way you understand what's going on there. And I also really liked your point about, yeah, it's as if people don't see that the church is the people. The church comes from the people. So I could see either one of or two things happening. something is happening culturally. A shift is happening culturally in the very people's understanding or theology or philosophy of God, or life in general, that is producing the kinds of people that are tending towards the manual tradition. Like there's something like wrong with society that's going to produce people doing and thinking in these kinds of ways.
Yeah.
Or you could see it as in perhaps this was what was necessary for those people. That I mean, like, goodness, the more complex dynamic picture, I mean, it's just difficult to understand, and certainly I didn't understand it as a child. Like, as a child, you understand things almost through a manual tradition.
Yeah.
And I mean, what you see in scripture is like a society, a people slowly being taught about the nature of God and the nature of salvation, and not every social order can see the whole picture as equally well.
Yeah, and it kind of helps to explain what we said earlier about like there's actually way more of the stuff in the patristic tradition. But then that leads to the question, well, if it's in the patristic tradition, how do we have this genealogy of it like all going bad in the Middle Ages? And well, the point is that it's not a strict line of genealogy. That's sort of an Enlightenment presumption. It's rather cycles. It's getting better and getting worse. I mean, this is all hinging on human freedom. So you can have, genealogy is hard when you're a Christian because it depends on how holy people are being in any given instance, what's going to apply.
Yeah, I guess my question for Illich would be, okay, so if what changed and what happened was the church's manualist tradition, like where did that come from? Because that wasn't always around. So it's not just the church, because the church has been around for much longer. So from what kind of culture did this come out of? Is this just the natural end of how theology goes, and the manual tradition has come and gone? So what do you make of that?
Yeah. If only he were around.
I did have another critique of his take on the confession, if we're ready to move to that.
Go for it.
Which is, it seems kind of one-sided. So he looks at the manual tradition and of like the confessor's gaze upon the penitent, and he's saying that this is a sexless gaze, and therefore the confession is an ungendered experience. But if you think about being the penitent, that you have absolutely the opposite experience. It's very gendered. Like, where do you go to confession? Like, you go to the church, which we always understand as being Mother Church. So you go to the womb of the church, you go into the confessional, and who do you speak to? Someone who is called Father. Like, you, the penitent, are not having a genderless experience. You're going as your gender, confessing your sins, like, to your parents, really, and experiencing forgiveness from the Father through the figure of this priest. And so it just seems like a very one-sided critique that I don't see how he misses that.
Yeah, and in a similar sense, you have to deal with the Gospels, or at least the letters of St. Paul, saying things like, there's neither man nor woman in Christ Jesus, as one of the sort of operative distinctions of society. So is he just saying that? What I mean to say is, it seems like there is a kind of negation of the gendered world that isn't the kind of negation that he's claiming, which is that in sin and in redemption, we really are both objects of Christ's redemption. Like, confession really is for both of us. So it does have, in some sense, from the very beginning of Christianity, a common message. In fact, this is part of what makes Christianity unique, is that it's common to men and women in its outreach. It's like, it's for all of us. It's not for the men, which is one of the big Roman critiques about it. It's a religion for women and slaves, right? So I just think that there's a certain reaching out to both that is proper to the church as mother, as you described, that isn't a negation of both into a genderless unit. And I
Yeah,
do think you experience that in confession.
and I think that kind of makes sense with that analogy, because it's like the mother and the father like working for the sake of her children, and children aren't sexless, but they're not entirely incorporated into the gender world
Sure.
either.
Yeah.
They kind of occupy like a third, not quite their space.
Yeah.
And so it seems appropriate that you, the penitent, are approaching as child, and maybe it's not exactly how he's reading it.
Well, it does seem like in all sin there's a certain genderlessness. And this will be something that's more brought up when we discuss some of my dissertation further. But I think people can get an intuitive grasp of this, right? Like if it means something to be a man, and if it's part of human flourishing to fulfill that particular nature. So I'm being an excellent man, I'm being the best man I can be, or whatever. And similarly, if it's true of women, that I'm being as I was created, I'm trying to perfect my nature. Then any kind of movement against that, any kind of movement against human nature, which is just what we describe sin as, is like violence against our nature, is inevitably going to be a sin against that part of our nature, against sexual difference. You're going to get a sort of rejection of the particularity of the person in favor of some more general drive satisfaction. So, for instance, like Augustine will describe all sin as becoming more like the beasts. So, actually moving down the kind of ladder, as it were, of sexual differentiation and becoming something less sexually differentiated.
Yeah, so when I violate my nature, I also violate my nature as woman, and so I remove myself more and more from the gendered world, and so I am really kind of placing myself more and more like the level of an animal that don't construct these kinds of worlds.
Yeah, totally. That's a really, really good way of putting it. Another thing Augustine says is that all sin is the movement of the soul into its own private domain. So there's a certain collapsing within sin of the socialness of the human creature. That's precisely the socialness that builds asymmetrical, distinct worlds and loves the dance between them. Obviously, if you're just in it for yourself in some way, it's hard to imagine that not also being a increasingly genderless state of being. But I think we're going to go into that a little more. So, all in all,
a brief comment just to swing it the other direction. Like I think that there's a certain hopefulness in that kind of vision, because when it comes to questions about like gender identity, or feeling like you don't like fit into what it means to be masculine or feminine, part of what the church is saying is that if you just pursue holiness, if you seek God first, you become more feminine, you become more masculine in the unique manifestation that means for you. And it's not going to be the same for every man, it's not going to be the same for every woman, but I think it just takes a lot of burden off of our shoulders to have that kind of perspective. Like, I don't have to have the mystery of what it means to be man and woman figured out. I just need to become holy, and by doing this, I become myself.
Yeah, no, and it's mistaking what a human ideal is. It's like, if it's true that we're constructing it, and we're constructing ourselves and the whole world into a pleasing offering to God, then it's not like we can anticipate it by being like, okay, here's exactly how the ideal works, and now let's do it. It's like, it happens in retrospect. It's like, by becoming holy, you just act for God, and then you construct the kind of woman and the kind of man that is pleasing to God. And it's unique. Like, it's not, it could have been otherwise, right? It has a certain contingency to it because it's the product of freedom, which makes it really beautiful. It's like anyone who says, like, I know what the ideal man is, and we need to conform to that vision of the ideal man, is just not being Christian at that point, because the ideal man is always yet to come until
I mean,
the heavens are rolled up.
Yeah, you're moving into a mystery. Like, you don't have to have it figured out. You don't have to have the ideal like perfectly like sketched out in order for you to seek that. I mean, I really do think that ultimately, like, what it means to be man and woman is a mystery of God that only he can penetrate, and part of the fun of this life is our seeking God and discovering what that particularly means in us as it unfolds in our life drama.
Yeah.
It should be an exciting thing, because I don't have to determine what that means for me. I get to discover what it means for me.
Yeah, and I think this is really obvious in the lives of the saints, right? Because so the saints are held up as like the exemplars, and so presumably they're also the ideal men and women on which to model our masculinity and femininity. But if you were to simply take any one saint and be like, here it is, so all men should be like this, it would be ridiculous, because there's a saint right next to him that's doing probably the opposite things with his manliness.
Exactly.
Yeah, if we're all men like Jerome, it's going to be a cantankerous world. But he was definitely a very manly guy. There's no doubt about it. Anyways, okay, so that's sort of our basic critique of the genealogy that are used, that the sort of centralized church power of confession created this genderlessness in the human soul. Though I do think that, again, it's fair to say that there is a way in which a perverse sort of moral impoverishment that we call the manual tradition does in fact create precisely the situation that Illich talks about. And we know it's true because it happens now. It's not just something in the past. It's like you can live out a sort of manual tradition life.
Totally.
And you will certainly find yourself as a sort of genderless, law-driven creature that lives in fear. And I think that's right. So I think he was right in a certain critique, but then he overextends it. Don't we all? Haven't we all been there? Okay, so that's enough ripping on Ivan, because we love Ivan. Ivan's the man. And in chapter 7, he proves this by being the man.
Everything about this chapter is amazing.
So I mean, you have to read the whole book to get to it. So, but I was going to say, if I could give you one chapter, just be like, just read this. Because he clarifies and really just re-says a lot of crucial claims and points in ways that are way clearer at the end than at the beginning.
Is helpful, because what he has to do in order to get there, because it's such a different way of thinking and seeing gender, he just has to give a lot of examples, which is what we've seen over and over again. And so now he can get to the end and kind of wrap it up.
Okay, so let's do it a little bit chronologically, and we're going to say the things we like about it, and hopefully end the discussion of Illich here. So I'll read the first part of it. The purpose of this essay, the whole book, is not a history of gender, but the elaboration of concepts allowing us to disentangle gender from sex within a history of scarcity. He then goes on to restate his position on the church. And then at the bottom here he says, gender-blind historians describe this transition as a transition to a capitalist mode of production, thereby hiding the fact that an ahistorical novum, something new, emerged from the mutation, a consumption-dependent producer who is necessarily sexist. Okay. When he describes gender-blind historians, he's basically describing people that would point to all the shifts without mentioning gender. For Illich, the destruction of gender is not a consequence of capitalism. It is not something that happens because capitalism happened. It's not an effect. It's a cause. You cannot have capitalism without destroying gender, is what he's arguing. Now, you might, as a listener, have a particular definition of capitalism. And I have given to the Lord the attempt to define capitalism, because everyone just says whatever they want. I had a guy tell me, I'm not lying, he was like, no, you're wrong about capitalism, because what capitalism is free exchange between consenting parties. It was like, oh, well, sweet, dude, if that's all that capitalism is, what's all the fuss about? What's with all the dead people and the wars and stuff over that? It's just like, we're just free exchange between people that want to do free exchange.
Sounds great.
Easy peasy. Okay, so I'm not going to sit here and argue why his definitions of capitalism are good definitions of capitalism. I think they are. You probably, if you are the person I'm thinking of, you probably think they're not. Just take it as his definition, because he's not just talking about whatever you want to insert into the word capitalism. He's talking about a thing. The thing is real.
Yeah, well, he's talking about like a historical economic phenomenon.
Yeah.
So I think what everyone can agree on is that like at some point there was a major shift in the way that economy moved, and it wasn't just an economic shift. There was huge cultural movements that happened as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if I don't know. I think what he's saying is that the two go together. You cannot have one without the other. The
Yeah,
destruction
but
of the
I don't
gendered
think
world.
he's just saying that, because he sees the gendered world as a limitation on avarice and on envy, which he thinks are necessary to.
I mean, I think they both wear each other down, is what.
Well, for sure. But I guess there's a certain starting place for him, which is that if you want. Okay, well, let me read this next part because it'll make more sense. So he says
Okay.
pre-capitalist societies are based on gender. Subsistence is a neutral term for this gendered survival. The shift to capitalism coincides anthropologically with the decline from broken gender into the regime of sex. Let's not go into that real quick, but he says societies in which the reign of gender has broken down are capitalist. Their genderless subjects are individual producers. Curiously, this decisive transformation has not been identified as the crucial anthropological condition that accounts for the transition from pre-capitalist economies to the growing commodity dependence for everyday needs called capitalism. Okay, what I want to point out is that he's given a definition here. What is capitalism? It is the growing commodity dependence for everyday needs.
Mm-hmm.
So what he means is we went from a world in which people could survive and live and even thrive by working and enjoying the goods of the earth, to a system in which survival increasingly, so it's kind of a sliding scale, is dependent on working for the sake of money
Mm-hmm.
to translate that money into commodities that you
Mm-hmm.
buy from other people
Mm-hmm.
in order to survive. So it's a difference in where survival comes from.
Right.
If survival within the Middle Ages was predicated on the fact that you owned enough land to take care of yourself, which was called subsistence. So if a subsistence economy was the basic way we could describe most organization of human life, and certainly it's there in the Middle Ages, then the transition is the destruction of the subsistence economy to a system in which survival is purchased. So you can see how the necessity of wage labor on the one hand, so you have to produce money, and production or commodity production on the other hand, so you have to produce things as commodities. That's to say, things that are available through money.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this for him is just what capitalism is. Again, if you disagree with the definition, that's fine. I'm just saying that obviously he's right. That did happen. We have gone to that. I mean, I don't know how you feel, but it seems to me pretty apparent that I need commodities to survive, and
Yeah.
that seems to be the world that we've lived in for a
If you
while now.
don't, if you don't have a wage job, you're dead.
Mm-hmm. Or you're. Oh no, man, I was gonna make a landlord joke, but that's fine. So.
Well, something else that I wanted to point out about that, maybe just another way of really saying the same thing. And these were notes that I was taking at the bottom. So this historical economic shift, which definitely happened, which is like in between there was this like kind of broken period.
Yeah.
Where you kind of have overlap, but this gradual shift, if we want to look at what are its markers, what is it marked by? And so he's saying that it's marked by this transition from subsistence living to dependence on wage labor. And this is what we would call capitalism. I mean, I think it makes sense to use that word too, because what we're emphasizing is like capital is the fact that you're depending more on money itself and that kind of wealth. And so, yeah, what I hear often is that people talk about capitalism being marked by a free market. Like what it means to be capitalist is to have the free market.
Yeah, totally.
But you find free markets before this giant shift. So that can't be the marker of the giant shift if it existed beforehand, often and everywhere.
I mean, if all you mean by a free market is the lack of state intervention within trading,
then
that's obviously
always been around.
We've had that because we haven't always had states. So by definition, we've had trading without state intervention.
Right. So you just need a different marker. And I think that this one is the obvious one that makes sense.
I'm going to read a few more things that helps define his critique here, which is really powerful, which is that you have got to destroy the kind of self-limiting worlds of gender in order to have the theoretically limitless world of capitalism. Again, you can see this sort of thematically. Like, obviously, if capitalism has as one of its goals profit, so just the production of an indefinite amount, this is distinct from the goal of subsistence, which is a definite amount, like what is needed to live. And so gender, because it is a limitation within the world, becomes an enemy, as it were, of the goal, at least, of capitalism, right? So if gender says women can do this but cannot do that, men can do this but only on these days, you have a natural and ingrained cultural resistance to getting everyone to work to make as much money as possible, getting everyone to buy similar things that are all produced as commodities. This is obviously the history of our society, in which there are fewer and fewer things besides bathrooms, which cannot be sold equally to men and women. So you can see this as like an expansion of a market into gendered worlds. He describes this a little. He's talking about a book Fernand Brandell wrote, where he says, he calls him an economic Bruegel, which is a compliment if you've ever heard one. He depicts a vast canvas of, so he's talking about prior to this shift. He says he depicts a vast canvas of material, institutional, and political life. He brings to life a post-medieval Europe teeming with fairs, markets, and workshops, expanding trade routes and associations. Throughout, he underscores the fact that what he calls capitalism, only very slowly penetrates into the procurement, production, and exchange of primary necessities. So this is just important. Like, subsistence was ground down. The gender domains were ground down. This is not like all of a sudden they're gone.
Right.
This author carefully searches for the changes that might explain this penetration and the reasons exponential capital accumulation became a factor affecting the everyday existence for most people before the beginning of the 19th century. He identifies growing market dependence, legal conditions protecting long-range accumulation, overseas expansion of economic space, but he consistently overlooks the universality of gendered existence in pre-capitalist societies and the loss of gender in the transition to capitalism. So this is Illich showing his cards a little bit, saying like, look, I know all of these things that go into capitalism. Like, I know all of the historical conditions that sort of combined in order to create the possibility of societies that were driven in the main by accumulation. I know. But gender matters. Like, you had to get rid of this as a limiting factor on the drive for accumulation, on the description of the human person as an individual just pursuing sort of endless profit, money. And so he gives a example that I really want to read to try and give some life to this shift, to this change.
Oh, yeah, this is
It's
brilliant.
a Lutheran village in Württemberg bears witness to the reactions of men and women faced with the first imposition of genderless work. So I'll just read it because it's great. 173. Between 1800 and 1850, the unusual number of 4 dozen divorce proceedings were recorded in Württemberg. David Sabian has tried to interpret the grounds given for the dissolutions, grounds unlike any adduced in earlier times. To understand what had occurred, he had to consider the economic transformation of the region during this period. A railroad was being built, tenancy was being altered, and most of the families were being forced from homesteading, that's subsistence living, toward producing cash crops from fruit trees, that is to say, making money and buying commodities for their survival. Plum and apple orchards, together with large-scale production of sugar beets, replaced diversified farms and kitchen gardens. Putting in and harvesting the cash crops proved to be more labor-intensive than homesteading had been, and the change occurred in one generation. Women were suddenly forced to join men in men's work in order to earn enough family income to buy what had formerly been grown in the garden plot. They were also forced to work more and faster in the kitchen. The divorce proceedings reflect how deeply disturbing these innovations were for both men and women, how helpless each felt, how unable to understand the implications of their seemingly rational decisions. Women complained that men suddenly ordered them around at work, a totally new experience for them. no matter how much the gender-defined work of women might seem subordinated to that of men. The notion that men could direct women in the work itself had so far been unimaginable. Women resented the loss of domain. Women also complained that while men had time after working at the rhythm of the plow to relax at the inn, they had to hurry back and forth between the hoe and the kitchen. Envy of a new kind, envy for the other gender's schedule and rhythm thus appeared, an envy destined to remain as a central characteristic of modern life, an envy fully justified under the assumptions of unisex work, but unthinkable under the shield of gender. The men, on the other hand, regularly complained that their women were inferior to their mothers. Formerly their diet had been rich and varied. Now they had to eat spätzle, I will say, day after day. The curtain closed on an epoch of broken gender and conjugal co-production. In this microcosm, we see vividly how the new script for the industrial age was to be written. For the drama to live and move, the stage had to be peopled with heterosexual actors who were also economically neutered workers.
There. Wow. Yeah. It's funny reading that. So, I mean, it's a historical narrative of an event that happened in one generation, but it sounds like what's still happening today.
Totally.
It just sounds so normal, especially the line where he writes, "Women complained." Wait, no. How helpless each felt, how unable to understand the implications of their seemingly rational decisions.
Yeah.
I mean, that's us today. Like, we're all trying to make rational decisions, and everyone feels equally helpless. Like, well, why isn't my rational decision working out? Because, I mean, these people are making rational decisions. We need to survive. We need this money to survive. And why is it that when I make this rational decision, it's just seeming to make me resentful?
Right, and destroy a marriage, right? Destroy fundamentally the dance between the two that had been all but presumed prior. Yeah, it does seem like a unwritten history. I don't think Illich is like over exaggerating in that regard. And what this shows is that you can't have I mean, when he talks about the way that we went from homesteading to producing cash crops, this is just to reiterate, I mean, the homestead by definition has its limit and thus is proper to gendered worlds, right? Because you can say, this is the kind of life that we want. Not that you actually phrase this to yourself, but you are working on getting what you want, surviving, living, thriving, enjoying. And you do so in a world which is fundamentally full of responsibilities, but they're between you, people you know, God, the land. And there's a certain constancy within those personal relations. Whereas the production of cash to then purchase commodities is not under those same restrictions. I mean, someone can change how much something costs. Someone can change how much you get paid. Right. The availability of land is scarce now, right? So you're not able to say, I'm going to produce these vegetables myself, right? And I think that's important to remember that when Illich is talking about gendered worlds, he's talking about people having domain, authority, rule over that process by which we subsist. He's not talking about like a CEO position over the process by which we make cash. He's saying that there was genuine authority for women and there's genuine authority for men. And for the first time, he's arguing, women experienced a loss of authority. Now, this seems really, really like current to me in that women often are told, it seems, that what they need is equality, right? But what they never get is authority. So they're always given, or the attempt is always made at least, to give them the same thing that men have. But there's not a domain which is their domain. This is the flip side, right, of the kind of repulsion we have towards any sense of like women belong in the kitchen, right? Because on the one hand, if it's coming from a unisex perspective, then it always sounds like a male is saying, go to your place, which is the kitchen, which is like a geographically isolated realm, which you are not allowed out of, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if we consider it as a domain where there's authority, then it's the woman who is able to say, get out of my kitchen.
Yeah.
And that this is actually still the case, I find, within many families, is just goes to show that gender doesn't go away. It just is less expressible, I think, within modern societies. That what we do long for is to have genuine authority that people can't take away from us. And that this really is a natural carving out of the world that men and women do as men and women.
Yeah, which I think it makes sense because it was specifically a commission to Adam to till and to keep, but I think it is the human commission to go and to create and to rule.
Yeah.
And so it means that like women also have a domain to do that.
Yeah.
And then that was taken away, and then suddenly they're being like, well, I mean, he says that the transition is broken. You don't immediately go into economic sex, but what happens is that women enter into the men's domain, and so they're having this experience of being ordered around like as a man,
right?
And I think that's what Illich would describe as like, well, that's sexist.
Yeah.
You can see, I can see how people today will look back on the past and totally miss that this change has happened.
Yeah.
Because it's just so different than anything that we would conceive of today.
Oh, I mean, you see it right now. If you ever describe something as like, well, the men worked in the fields and the women stayed at home, you're inevitably assuming it's oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And also that's how we actually describe pre-modern societies, which is ridiculous because they all went to the fields. Like,
yeah.
So yeah, there's a complete loss of understanding the world as bifurcated between realms of authority that are not in some kind of antagonistic relationship with each other, but in fact, precisely as authority, they're enjoyed.
Yeah.
Domain is enjoyed.
Yeah, and I liked, I'm trying to find where else he says this. That there still is a subordination of the women's domain to the male domain. And even the way that dance is done is different between societies. So that is going on. But it's not as if the women don't actually have authority within their domain. And in fact, like they have more leverage against the male domain. Like if men, like if a man chooses to act in an unjust manner towards a woman, she now has like this network, like this whole domain by which to like correct and shame this man, which he's already given examples of that in the past.
Yeah.
Which were fun.
Yeah, no, it just seems impossible now though. Okay, so what else?
Oh, yeah, he gives some reasons as to why there was this blind spot that were really interesting. This is on the next page, 175.
Oh yeah.
Like why is it that no one has seen that this enormous shift has happened? He says 2 reasons. On the one hand, the new experience of economic misery became the glue of proletarian unity.
Mm-hmm.
So now there really is a unified experience of everyone being miserable,
right?
And this is the thing that's bringing us together as this class, and then it's kind of moving into like a socialist like attitude of upper class and lower class,
right?
And we're all in misery in the lower class,
right?
And so that becomes the emphasis in how we see the world as being broken up. It's not in these 2 domains; it's being broken up in the upper class and the lower class.
Yeah, it's way more convicting. Given that your misery is now class-based, to say that all of human society is in fact class struggle and not gender.
Right, yeah. He says all wage labor suffered from the very same epidemic of disorientation, loneliness, and dependence. So the sexless unification like actually becomes the reality.
Yeah.
Right. It actually becomes your experience. And so now we have this blind spot.
Yeah, and then he goes on to talk about something that we talk about a lot within different fields with New Polity, which is that every society needs its past. So one of the reasons there's a blind spot is because we are actively involved in the creation of a past that is not true to the historical narrative, but which justifies and explains our present moment. So the way that Andrew Jones describes this in relation to, and not just Andrew, quite a few people have described this in relation to religion, is that in fact, if you look at the Middle Ages, you had a unique act, a unique society in which the society as a whole was conceived of as a church, in which there were different powers, there were different emphases, there were different vocations, there's a diversity, but which certainly had no concept of like a secular realm defined as something without the church, in which the church was unnecessary, in which God was not involved, in which was somehow an irreligious sort of neutral space that may or may not relate to the religious, but in itself does not. This is how we now describe the world, precisely because we have suppressed the church as mattering to society, as being politically relevant, as being a real story about humanity. Through the Protestant Reformation up into modernity, this has been in place. So now what we do is we look back on the Middle Ages, on its various structures, and we say, oh, okay, so they have the state and the church just like we did, but like it looks like the church has all this power over the state here. And we basically describe a past that there's like this nascent secular realm that is going to blossom gloriously into our secular society, in which we realize history really is secular and the church is this sort of thing you can do within the secular.
Right.
Andrew's point is, okay, we're inventing a past here. Right? This is not how a medieval understands himself. This is how we understand medievals. Right. Because of our world. And he's saying, Illich is saying, I think that the same thing is happening with gender. We are rewriting the script, as it were, so that when we look on the past and see gender domains, for instance, we can only describe this as sexism, in which women are oppressed to be in some place, which modernity will eventually save through this gradual process of producing equal wage earners. Right? Yeah. And so we look back on that and we say, oh, men could do this and women couldn't. So what we have here is, of course, sexism, early sexism, to be resolved by birth control and other stuff.
Right. I think it'd be worth reading the way that he puts it on 176. Okay. The bottom. So he writes, society needs a past. To have a sense of the present, the living require a past that fits them. There is no first person plural, no we without its myth of creation. The two-gendered we of all times was kept alive by each society's rituals, feasts, and taboos. Industrial society, too, needed a myth of creation. It could not exist without one. So it created a special institution to provide each household with news and a constant sense of a past. The past became an industrial enterprise. And then later on the next page, he says, which is basically what you were saying, Marc, powerful enterprises attempted to make the past appear as a seed, a primitive form of the present. Yeah, so if what men and women really are like these genderless powers, these genderless humans, then that's inevitably true of the past as well. So the way that we describe what was going on in the past necessarily shifts. The myth, the story itself shifts. Yeah. And I don't think this is I mean, like maybe it sounds like a critique or a bad thing, but I mean this is just true. Like if when you believe new things, the meaning of the past changes, and sometimes this is like an actual needful thing. Like you can imagine like you have a relationship with someone and then you find out that they've been lying the whole time. Suddenly, like the interactions that you had like legitimately meant something, but now that you know something true that was true from the very beginning, it changes the whole narrative of what was happening.
Shoots an arrow into the past.
So if we come up with a new anthropology, it's not like it would be only natural that we would rewrite the past because it actually changes its meaning. This is just how it works.
Yeah, and he points to Marx and Freud as two people that are actively and in an early way engaged in redescribing man to fit the destruction of gender. So you can't describe man as a asymmetrical being there's always two sides to everything. Everything is up against its complement or its opposite. Instead, you have to have a fundamental sameness as the defining characteristic of man. And so with Marx and Freud, it's man considered as a conduit of capital for Marx, and man considered as a conduit of libido for Freud. In both cases, there's a genderless reality that explains human behavior. So we can say, men or women, whatever, you're all going to do this because capital is king. Men or women, whatever, you're all going to do this because libido is king. He says it well. He says, Marx and Freud forged the definitive concepts that would be used to describe and orchestrate the new kind of actor industrialized man. 700 years earlier, the church had imputed genderless sin to genderless souls. Now the genderless power of genderless humans in a genderless cosmos became the key transcendental characteristic of the categories used in a new kind of metaphysics. Around the middle of the 19th century, a dozen natural scientists simultaneously, though independently, redefined the living force of the universe as energy, sometimes bound, sometimes free. Then says that labor force was made into a key concept by which the human contribution to human existence could be treated as a scarce resource, again, genderless, sometimes bound, sometimes free. Finally, a generation later, Freud attributed psychic energy in the form of libido, sometimes bound, sometimes free, to the human. The new canonists fabricated their theory of secular man and his salvation on assumptions derived from chemistry and fluid mechanics. They claimed to find a genderless power that, as capital, circulates through social conduits and as libido through psychological channels. And he makes fun of this later, because then we look back on the past and we write about, he says, we report on the sex life of Mesopotamia, and laughs at that, because it's like, well, we read that and then just presume that everything we experience is what was experienced through all time.
Right. So,
yeah.
But what I like that he points out is that his goal of this book is just to call attention to this huge divide of gender and sex.
Yeah.
Like, he's not claiming to write this giant historical narrative. All he's pointing out is that, hey, there was a major shift that we're all overlooking, and he's tried to expose the counterfeit genealogy of sex that underlies economic history. Or in other words, like, okay, so now we've made this assumption of economic sex, and so then if you're trying to explain how we got here, you're going to use this genealogical critique that rewrites this narrative of how we got here, and he's trying to expose it as counterfeit because it doesn't actually comprehend the past. Which is awesome.
And it definitely seems true. Like, just applying sexism to the past doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, no.
You really liked the quote on 178, and I feel like I can't take it from you.
Okay, thanks.
Under the reign of gender, right?
Right. I'll just start at the beginning of the. Where do we? Well, no. I'll set it up a little bit. So what he's doing at this point is kind of recapping, right? The reign of gender and economic sex in some ways, and he describes each of them as matrices. Like, they're each is a matrix, right? It's a social structure of like power, of domain, etc. So he says, whether they are born outside the matrix of gender or first delivered from and then educated into the matrix of sex, women must face men. Each matrix, however, endows them with different relative power. And that's basically what he's been out to like show. Like, here's how each of these matrices work. Yeah. Here's how the power is distributed. Under the reign of gender, men and women collectively depend on each other. Their mutual dependence sets limits to struggle, exploitation, defeat. Vernacular culture is a truce between genders, and sometimes a cruel one, where men mutilate women's bodies. The gynoecium is, I think, how you pronounce it, or just like the women's domain, often knows excruciating ways to get back at men's feelings. In contrast to this truce, the regime of scarcity, or which is this move into economic sex, imposes continued war and ever new kinds of defeat on each woman. Okay, so we could just pause there because one of my favorite lines showed up. So one of my major critiques reading this book is that when he looks back on like the matrix of gender or the reign of gender, he never seems to critique it. It always seems to be like this like natural ideal, and then here for one line he admits for the first time that sometimes vernacular culture, it's a truce between genders, and sometimes it's a cruel one. Sometimes the construction can actually be a cruel construction, and I wish he would have gone into more detail on this. I think it would have been a lot more convincing probably for his readers and the people that he's trying to convince, but it just gets a line.
Yeah, and he goes on, while under the reign of gender, women might be subordinate. Under any economic regime, they are only the second sex. They are forever handicapped in games where you play for genderless stakes and either win or lose. Here, both genders are stripped and neutered. The man ends up on top. Which is just a really clear way of explaining his thesis.
Yeah.
That you can have subordination. You can have women being told what to do in certain respects. But what you don't have is the total loss of domain, the total loss of any authority, the entrance of women into a supposedly unisex world that has actually taken its cue from the male industrial worker, and then the constant loss of women within that world.
Yeah, and I think the key word in one of the sentences is while under the reign of gender, women might be subordinate. Under any economic regime, they're only the second sex.
Yeah.
So you could conceive of a gendered domain where the dance is done differently.
Yeah.
Or he pulls out some extraordinarily rare examples of matriarchal societies. How is it that you had these very strict gendered worlds, which we would just immediately dismiss as sexist, but you can't because it's matriarchal.
Right.
They're still operating kind of out of the same system, just the dance is done differently.
Yeah.
And you can make arguments that this is not a very good dance.
Right.
But it explains how that could be the case, and they're still operating under the same principles. And then he goes on to say that basically like the woman kind of discovers herself as like invisible. She can neither perceive herself in the regime of economics as an equal partner, nor can she recognize herself in gender. So once we've moved into economic sex, she can't compete and win in the same way that a man can, again, because she can get pregnant. She can't make as much money if she's having the babies. But she doesn't have a gendered domain where she can recognize herself either.
Yeah,
she just loses.
He has this just brutal line: the sexist utopia of her land fails to provide the rank consolations of the locker room and attempts to reconstruct women's past with keywords. So I think we all know what that means at this point. Like, the women get to live essentially a fantasy of a never arriving end to sexism. You get to watch movies where women are superheroes that can do super cool things. You get to theorize about a feminist future that somehow never arrives. My favorite thing is whenever they're like, the male birth control pill, it's coming this year, and they've been doing it since like the 70s. It's almost on its way. It's almost on its way. Yeah. So it's this, like, women don't get actual equality. They get the fantasy of a future equality that never arrives. And then this is compared to a world in which they were supposedly oppressed, but in which Illich is saying, no, you might have been contingently subordinated. There might have been cruelty, no doubt. But the idea that as woman, you were defined as the loser is not true. The idea that as woman, you are defined as lacking in authority and domain, not true. The idea that as woman, you have no comparable experience of real community that men enjoy in the locker room and elsewhere, not true. You did. You lack these things because something real has been destroyed, and you are being made to compete for something posing as a neutral unisex work, which is actually in the image of the male, which is actually the work of people who can't get pregnant.
Yeah.
That's what's really happening, and that seems to be totally accurate, whatever else you think about Illich's book here.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the insight of what has been lost and what it means to live in a gendered world is really enlightening, and especially the example that we read of what happened within the generation of that one Lutheran town was just extremely illuminating.
Yeah.
For what exactly has happened, which kind of leads into my last point.
Take it away.
Yeah, this is maybe my second favorite line in the whole book on page 179. I have no strategy to offer.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't get that excited about that, but I just appreciate his honesty, that he's not sitting there from like this idealist perspective, like, and here's how we can reconstruct the gendered worlds. Like, he realizes what an enormous project that would be. And part of the reason why it was around is because it was something organic, and you can't manufacture that. And if we tried to do that, we would just fail.
Oh, totally. Because the trads try to do it all the time. They're like, I can reconstruct a gendered world, no problem.
It's like, it doesn't work, because what it means to have a gendered world is to like fit within a social whole, and so you're doing it in a very disjointed kind of manner. Yeah, and like it doesn't compete with the past, and maybe that's kind of a cynical view, but I have a theory that cynicism is really hopeful. And that like realism itself is a hopeful thing, because like now we kind of see where the cards are out on the table.
Yeah.
And we can see what's possible. And because we don't have unrealistic expectations of how we're going to change everything and bring back the gendered worlds, which you can't as a singular person, you can't as a singular household. I mean, you can make better moves, and that's important, and it's going to make your life happier, for sure. But then there's a lot less pressure on yourself. Like, I thought I was doing the things right. I mean, I see that sometimes happening in like Catholic marriages. Like, I thought I was doing this thing right, but I'm still running into all these difficulties. Like,
I was living authentic femininity, but I'm still lonely.
Yes.
Well, I do think there's a little, maybe not more hope than you're giving it, but if Illich is right that it's so tied to capitalist society, especially in terms of dependence on commodities for survival, then there is a kind of reverse engineering trick that, if you just destroy capitalism, then you produce gender. And I don't mean this sort of in the cynical like socialist way, because socialists are just capitalists. I mean it in the sense of like a return to any kind of subsistence. And again, not trying to be an idealist here. It's just like, okay, when the question is how do we make money in order to buy the commodities we need to survive, obviously everything falls into place as the same regime of economic sex that we've been discussing. But the moment you're like, okay, honey, let's have a garden together, and let's not just have it as like the kind of romantic thing that we do on the side. So it's really a luxury activity that we provide for on the basis of wage labor, so that economic sex produces the appearance of gender that we kind of LARP on the weekends over. But let's actually depend on it, right? Let's get to a point of where we are depending on ourselves and not money for subsistence. And not, I say the broad ourselves, like the community as well. Then there's a certain argument that it's not that you're constructing a gendered world, it's that a gendered world will happen because it has to. Because the actual business, not of making money and spending it, but of living, involves the division of tasks. It involves a choice between men and women about who will do what. It involves many hands in order to make the labor work. It involves those kinds of decisions that will create gendered domains, that will give authority, because you're actually owning something you're actually having realms of activity that you do have authority over, and that authority has to go somewhere, either to a man or to a woman. So I do think within a household that to any degree turns away from a dependence on the consumption of commodities and towards ownership of the means of production and working land and deciding to make things and fix things instead of just buy things and discard things. Wherever this happens, you're going to have the tug, as it were, of the dance between man and woman, because you're going to have to figure out how to actually do it.
Yeah,
And you can't just translate it into money, meaning that women or man can equally shop, you know?
yeah, I wonder if it could be even more simple than that, because not everyone's in a position where
Oh,
like they
yeah,
can
no,
do
I'm
that.
not saying it's possible for everyone,
Um,
just,
and yeah, I think actually being totally subsistent and being totally self-sustaining as a homestead is not possible.
yeah, I mean, it depends on what you mean,
Um,
I think. If you mean like it's not possible without a community doing the same thing and contributing and building up a common good, then yeah, I agree.
yeah. But uh, what he was pointing out in the book is what having the gendered worlds did was it put limits on things.
Sure.
And maybe that's the frame of reference that we can have. And I think this is kind of a new polity thing in general. And this is why I've enjoyed discussing this book in particular, because we're starting, I think it highlights how all of these things really go together. Um, like a topic that seems like not political
Yeah.
at first, except for like in our current moment,
Yeah.
turns out is inherently political, because it changes how we structure our society. If you are living a life that I mean, so what subsistence living is doing is that your goal is not to just accumulate. Your goal is not to see the numbers in your bank account just rising. Your goal is to like have this way of life and to have enough, and once you've kind of hit it, then you're good. I think this is an example that comes from something that Andrew's written. I've read a lot of it, so I'm not sure where anymore. um but somewhere he was describing, and this is going to be a really poor rendition of what was going on. You have like a move to industrialization happening in the cities, and then you have this small town, and you have the capitalists coming out and like hiring them for wage labor. And so they want the farmers to work more, so they say to themselves, well, let's just pay them more money. They'll get excited about getting paid more,
Yeah.
and so they'll want to work more for us. But the opposite happens, because they're still living a subsistence way of life. They're getting paid more, so they're like, awesome, I will work half the hours now.
Yeah. Once you get what you need, you're done.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
maybe like that's the kind of attitude that will kind of bring about the natural dance. Like, this is the goal, like
Yeah.
this is where our needs are.
Yeah.
And if we're not constantly striving to get more and more better updated commodities,
Right.
that's just going to change the whole dance that your like family is doing, or
Yeah.
maybe your broader community is doing.
Right. Right. It does seem like you need to desire other people to have authority for any kind of restoration to be possible, which I think is,
Hmm.
it may seem like a vague desire, but I think that most people in America don't have it because we want to be sovereign. We want to have all the authority, and we see any absence of it as a neglect of what is owed to us in some way. But the positive desire to not have everything, to not have it all,
Hmm.
seems to be requisite for a gender domain to say, like, oh, how good that someone else has domain here and I don't. How good it is to not be here. How good
Yeah.
it is. It's like the flip side of a love of place and a love of people is a love of not every place and not every people and not everything. You know what I mean? Obviously, there's a sort of cosmic way where you can have a sort of all embracing desire for everything. Um, but I think that's fulfilled in the church. But let's not go there. My point is that the desire for other people to have authority and to give it up, so that when you work, you're not working for accumulation, but you're actually working to maintain the domain and authority of women and men. Um, and you're actually enjoying that. that just seems like a requisite that's very hard for us to inhabit. To
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, how do I live and move in such a way that more people, not less, have authority, even authority over me? This is, I think, a fundamentally, I don't think it's a purely Christian way of thinking, but I think Christianity has given it wings, as it were. Like, I think in pre-Christian societies, you have this as a sort of limitation principle because excess always produces strife. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
certain like avoidance of, well, let's keep people in their place and keep people doing their thing so as to not, an excess of accumulation would be kind of disastrous for a small peasant community, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But within Christianity, it's actually it can be incorporated into the command to love our neighbors, like so that they can be restored to that Edenic call to till and to keep the garden.
Right.
And if we have that as an actual Christian motivation to extend authority wherever we see it, then I think we have the requisite attitude for, again, not the solution, not a program, but the requisite attitude for restoring gendered worlds, because then we would rejoice to find that someone has genuine authority over us as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to envy it.
Yeah, I can think of one like helpful example, and one of the things I think it's exciting what Illich is pointing out is that the construction can be rendered in different ways.
Yeah.
So here's one way that I'm seeing it is in the budget that a couple has. So in America, like you hear like stories of everyone, focused on equality and fairness. And so like the couple just like cut their budget in half.
Mm.
Or like the couple, like each of them will go to work and the money that they earn is still theirs. I mean, they really are just like two individuals kind of in a contractual relationship monetarily.
Yeah.
A different example of that would be a homeschool family that I know where like the wife is in control of the budget because she's literally running the household.
Yeah.
And so that domain and authority has been officially handed off to her. The husband, like you were explaining, like he does not worry about the money. Like he works and he focuses on that. He doesn't have to stress about the budget at all because he has rendered that domain to her, the one who's running like the household and getting the food together and like
right. And it would involve him, I imagine, because I am in exactly the same position, in shame, deep shame, to try and like insert oneself periodically into that world and to say, you know what I mean? Like it would take on the trappings of a real gender transgression to say like, well, show me the book. So you're doing a good job here. Because then you would have completely undermined real authority, and you would have made it actually authority that's just sort of held out as like a, well, it's fictional. It's not real authority. It's just like a delegation of the male thing to a woman, which is not the same as an actual giving it up.
Yeah, and then to kind of tie in what Andrew writes a lot about with like the peace of society or like the peace of the family. So like in this situation, like you have a piece of how the household is being run, but then maybe at some point you have like some like obstruction to the peace. Like maybe the wife is irresponsible with the budget, or like the man like runs off and like buys something super expensive without running it by her first. And so like then they come together and like there's a moment of like tension and like working things out so that the peace can be restored and you can go back into your domains again.
Right. Yeah, it's not like
and it's not like, I mean, like that's how it's supposed to be done. It's not like he's transgressing by like bringing up the problem, or it's not like she's transgressing like by bringing up the problem.
Yeah, it's like within worlds that are seeking after peace through subsistence, sin really does disrupt them. And being open to that disruption, like if we are not good to each other, if we are not respectful of each other's domain, if we are not holy and striving after holiness, there will be problems, is part of the risk of love. It's the risk of family. It's the risk of Christianity, ultimately, which doesn't say like, oh, we have a constitution that works every time. If women do this and men do that, you're good to go, no conflicts. It says, let's live in such a way that if we are not good to each other, we'll feel it. And I see this in the case of establishing any kind of gender domain, in at least in our contemporary situation, that when you agree to do that, when you say, okay, you know what, I'm not going to look at the bank account, it's yours, or you know what, the garden's yours, the laundry's yours, I don't know, whatever it is, however you do it, it's this dependence on the other that you establish, which if the other is neglectful or if you are domineering, the peace will be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like you get to, like there's no safety there. It's risk.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what makes it so fun and enjoyable. Is like, hey, let's divide up the world between ourselves and enjoy it. And if
Yeah.
we're bad, it won't work. That's the risk of goodness, which it seems like every family has the capacity to do, and that alone, I think, would build up not a gendered world, right? Because that's not, it can't make it this kind of thing that happens within the families, but it would build up something that could become it within the
Mm-hmm.
next generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if that could become an actual, if it could actually involve communal production, if it could actually involve men and women working together as men and women um, on mutual work.
Yeah. Well, there's one final point that I wanted to say, and I'm glad that you said what you did because I'd forgotten it. But I was really excited that he used the word matrix.
Because it's a
Like
fine film.
I was disappointed
Oh
when I
yeah.
watched it. It was so hyped up, and then I finally got around to it, and I was just anyway. We won't go there. Um, but um, I think this is a way of looking at the future with hope. Is like seeing, okay, like what we have right now is like a this like social structure, this matrix of power.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, the idealist would say, well, we want to go back to these gendered worlds. This is better. And so then try to like construct this path of like, well, here's how I'm going to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just in my life, or like, here's the path that society has to take.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how reality works, because as soon as you change the matrix, so let's say that you do have a community where families are like, they've put like a limit, like they don't want to just accumulate stuff, they're just living for a rhythm of life.
Yep.
And they are living more within the gender domains. What happens is that the matrix itself shifts, and so it creates like new power dynamics, new openings that literally did not exist there before, and
Right.
maybe ones that you didn't even possibly imagine.
Right.
Like there's new ways to move in the world that are available for the next generation that just simply weren't there. Like they were not moves on the table to make,
Right.
but now they are. And I think that's how change is going to like happen, and it's not something that you can totally predict. Like you want to be aware of what's possible right now and like the moves that you can be making, but as soon as you make one, you've shifted the entire field.
Right.
And I think this too is also exciting, in just kind of the work of being a Christian and the work of constructing the world in general. Like the world itself is not predictable, it's not
Yeah.
controllable.
Yeah.
I find this exciting. Other people find this anxiety inducing.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's a surprise, and anything you do, if you have any kind of desire to change the world, which apparently we all do, has to be received by children, right? In order for it to persist, and you can never guarantee who those people are. Like the very passing down of
Right.
tradition implies a radical letting go of control. Um, it doesn't mean it's not good. It doesn't mean like it's destined for failure. It just means it's not centralizable. It's an adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think when I look at um, the difference between the gendered world and what follows is that there seems to be a certain openness to surprise and to adventure in the latter, or in the former, but not the latter. Um, whereas there's a sort of modern presumption that we've arrived and that we're always going to be doing the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
which is maybe a paradox. But anyways, we should stop, I think. So, gender. There's the book. It's a great book. What we're going to do next is pretty simple. We're going to, having wrapped up this book, we're going to turn a little bit back to some of the research I've been doing for my dissertation on the early church fathers' interpretations of gender. Hopefully get to a more positive description of what I think gender is all about in the Bible. And the reason why I think Illich is a good start to that is because he provides the words for talking about androgyny or genderlessness as a really possible social construction that I think he's describing as this new thing, but Spoilers, I think, is actually how most human societies end up thinking about the nature of man or woman apart from grace. Not all the time, but it does seem to me that the Jewish people were fundamentally opposed to a strikingly similar concept of primal androgyny that seemed to be an anthropology in which gender difference, sexual difference, is considered to be a subsequent modification of a fundamentally genderless type. And I do think that's in the church fathers. I think it's in the scriptures. And so I think what we'll do is
talk about
that and then wrap up this season of the politics of gender. Fair?
Sweet.
Okay. Till next time. Thank you, everyone.